The incident occurred on the 18th of November 2013 on the border between Southern California and Mexico, and became a viral news story in the US. It cost the government $1 million, but this wasn't the biggest price that was paid for the incident. A young man was detained at the US-Mexico border at approximately 6:20 a.m. on the 18th of November 2013. He headed confidently towards the Daily Crossing security checkpoint. This checkpoint is intended for those who cross the border every day. For example, those who reside in Mexico but work in Southern California. However, this guy caught the border security agent's attention. His name was Cruz Velasquez, and at the time he was just 16. He told the border crossing guards that he was going to a friend's place for a couple of days. However, the guards were particularly interested in his bags and asked to take a closer look. During the inspection, the border guard noticed that the teenager was very nervous. His eyes were darting around everywhere and there was a tremor in his voice. The guard became very suspicious because of this. So he decided to send him to the officers who carry out extensive inspections and the questioning of suspicious passengers. The officers on duty that day were Adrian Perry and Valerie Baird. Firstly, they checked the boy's documents, but did not ask him any further questions. They then looked through his luggage. Officer Baird opened his bag and, alongside his clothing, he discovered 2 bottles containing an unknown liquid, which aroused suspicion from the officers. An enormous quantity of illegal drugs enter the U.S. from Mexico every year. Smugglers transport the drugs by disguising them as ordinary legal products. At the time, the border agents had recently learned that cartels were transporting methamphetamines by dissolving it in liquids. The officers suspected that this may be the nature of the liquid that they had found. However, the teenager insisted that it was just apple juice. At this point, officers Perry and Baird decided to abandon protocol and play the suspect at his own game. According to protocol, when the guards suspect that they may have found narcotics hidden in liquids, food, and so on, they must seize the items and test them for traces of drugs. However, instead of seizing the bottles, the officers suggested with a smile that the boy should prove that the bottles doesn't contain any prohibited substances by taking a couple of sips. He had no choice but to go along with what they asked. He knew what was really in the bottle, so he sipped hesitantly. The officers had also figured out what was in the bottles, but instead of sticking to protocols, they continued to play the boy at his own game. So when he tried to close the bottle, Officer Baird told him to take another sip. They were curious to see how far he would go to avoid telling the truth. Meanwhile, they themselves could take this deadly game too far. 2 minutes after his first couple of sips, despite being aware of the risk he was putting the teenager in, Officer Perry laughed and suggested the boy take 2 more sips of the so-called apple juice. At this point, the boy knows there is no turning back, but he also knows that each sip could be his last. With each sip, he started to hesitate more, but he still insisted that the contents of the bottles was just apple juice. The officers had already decided that they won't let him through customs. They had checked his documents once again. Only at this point does the teenager show some signs that he is not feeling well. The officers had already decided that they won't let him through customs. They checked his documents once again. Only at this point does the teenager show some signs that he is not feeling well. He began sweating profusely. He started to shake and he got more and more nervous. Then the officers performed a frisk search but did not find anything on his person. However, it is clear that he is mixed up in something. Then their suspicions were confirmed by a sniffer dog trained to detect narcotics. The dog indicated that the suspect had been in contact with prohibited substances. As a result, he was handcuffed and taken to a secure room for questioning. By this point, half an hour had passed since his first sip of the liquid. The boy was brought to the admin's desk to register his paperwork. Everyone around had finally noticed that something wasn't right. Officer Baird, who had first suggested he drink the liquid, checked his temperature, and he was extremely hot to the touch. The boy started shouting loudly in Spanish, "My heart, my heart." He started vomiting and screaming even more loudly in pain. Only at this point did the officers decide to call for medical assistance. By the time the ambulance arrived, the boy's body temperature had reached 41 degrees. He was immediately taken to the nearest hospital where he died from a drug overdose around 2 hours after first drinking the liquid. The bottles he was carrying did indeed contain methamphetamine. The 16-year-old Cruz had recently been recruited by the cartel, and this was his first attempt to smuggle drugs. Cartels deliberately recruit minors to smuggle drugs, because if they are caught at the border, they will only be behind bars for a few months before being deported. Cruz most likely feared what would happen to him when he went back home more than he feared the official punishment from the Border Patrol, so he decided to play this deadly game with the officers. Officer Baird was also taken to the hospital alongside Cruz as she had been in contact with the bottle containing the methamphetamine. By chance, she ended up in the room next to Cruz and could hear all of his screams before dying. After this incident, there was an investigation. Both Officer Baird and Officer Perry denied telling the boy to drink the lethally dangerous substance. They told the investigators that Cruz had done this voluntarily. Despite the fact that this is obviously not true from looking at the security camera footage, they of course did not face any consequences.
I never asked him to, he volunteered to, and I believe I gestured to him to go ahead.
You told him to go ahead and drink on more than one occasion, did you not?
No.
And you're sure of that?
I'm sure.
As you would expect, Cruz's family described him as a smart and kind boy who just fell in with the wrong crowd. Eventually, they managed to get a $1 million settlement from the U.S. government for Cruz's death, which they believe was due to the negligence of customs officials. In their opinion, the 16-year-old's death is the sole responsibility of Officers Baird and Perry. However, many people argue that he himself is to blame, as he chose to smuggle drugs across an international border that day. He chose his fate much earlier when he decided to become a member of a large Mexican drug cartel.